and welcome to this settler Presbyterian church. In fact, this church is a replica of a kirk on the outside of Glasgow, the Fletcher family, and so it was built in 1933, but there's been a church here since 1875, and I suppose that's a good place to start, because we here the community comes out of settler spirituality, Pākehā settler spirituality, Scottish. And yet, as we've been here nearly 150 years, the spirituality of the land, of the tangata whenua, of the tangata tiriti, all who've come here, has influenced and shaped the spirituality of this place. And my sense with your book, Becoming Pākehā, is about an emergent spirituality, not Māori spirituality, but an emergent Pākehā, tangata tiriti spirituality of this place. So would you like to comment on that?
I hope that's what my book is about. In some ways, it's almost premature to talk about a treaty-based spirituality, but I think the signs are there, and I think it is very slowly emerging. But this treaty spirituality that will eventually have to shape the country, it will have to describe the soul of Aotearoa. And I think the attempt to look ahead in He Puapua, the report that was published amid much fanfare and gnashing of teeth about how the country would look in 2040 on the bicentennial of the treaty. I think the controversy around even attempting to map out what 2040 might look like is a measure of how fragile this thing called treaty spirituality might be. That's why I say it might even be premature to talk about it yet. But having said that, we have to talk about it, just like we have to talk about co-governance. We have to talk about constitutional reform. We have to talk about the revival of the language. We have to talk about the curriculum of the schools to teach our story. We have to begin to be doing these things in order to get to 2040, so that we pray God, might be able to say in 2040, we are shaped by our treaty spirituality.
I mean, I see a whole lot of positive signs. Maybe it's because I'm an optimist, but I see a synergy around care for the land, the environment, about climate change. I see there's some synergy there between kaupapa Māori and an emerging kaupapa Pākehā about that. It might not be where the politicians argue up here, but there's an affinity for the people who live in this place. Not saying that politicians don't live here, but there's some areas of deep affinity. I think that's reflected in things like how we do tangihanga, as in Pākehā version of funerals now, is quite different than even when I was ordained 40 years ago. And there's a whole raft of things that are just coming along. Waikara Moana and Te Uruwera and that so-called co-governance was actually under the changing legislation that made Uruwera instead of a national park something that Tūhoi can control and be part of, and it is part of them. Well, I've been walking in that park all my life, and it just seems so natural that Tūhoi should actually be in charge of that place. It's their place, and I come as and that feels right and proper, much more right and proper than walking on kind of no man's land of a national park. So I see all these little things that are emerging, and it fills me with some hope.
And me too. And my book is full of stories of that hope. That's one of the reasons I wrote the book, because because I want people to trust that it is going to be possible to get there. Now, Maori don't need too much reassurance about that anymore. They used to, when they were marginalised, when the treaty was not recognised, when te reo wasn't spoken and was forgotten in schools, in fact punished for its use. Back then, Maori did need reassurance that they would ever get there, that that treaty partnership would ever be honoured. But I don't sense Maori needing any reassurance now. The people that need some reassurance are Pākehā. And why do they need reassurance? Because they feel a bit overwhelmed by the speed of change, by the way in which Maori are speaking with a confidence and a surety that makes Pākehā people nervous. When I was launching this book, and I've been around the country in all the main centres talking about it, and I had a crowd of people in Christchurch who were sitting there talking, listening to me and then asking questions. But in the front row, a Maori woman with a beautiful moko kawai on her chin sat there looking at me very sternly throughout the whole talk, and at the question time didn't say a word. And as I was leaving, she came up to me and she said, "I've got one question for you. What are Pākehā afraid of?" And I was a bit taken aback, and I paused for a moment and I said, "Well, I think they're afraid that they're going to lose the front seat in the bus." She said, "Well, why didn't someone say so?" And I think that's in a nutshell where we are. Pākehā people don't even want to be known as Pākehā people. The term doesn't even fit very well, especially for people who don't come from a European heritage. So we've got to do some work on these terms that we use to describe ourselves. But whatever word we use, we have to get to the point where we can speak with confidence as the partner to the treaty. And the last thing that Maori need is a partner who's uncertain of him or herself, who's inarticulate, who's unable to express what it means to belong here and to call this place home. The other reason I wrote the book was that in 1983 Michael King wrote a book called Being Pākehā, and it was a very different take on this to what I present. But one of the things he said in his book back then was, Pākehā are indigenous. We have the right to say we are indigenous. Now, it would be a brave or foolish person to stand up in 2023 and say, we are the indigenous people. So we've got to reshape this debate. We've got to check the language that we use to describe ourselves, and we've got to find new ways of articulating how it is that we can claim the right to call this place home. There's a lovely statement that Pat Snedden made in a sermon he preached in Glynn a few years ago, and he put it like this. He said, he being a strong Catholic layman Pākehā, how much more satisfying it would be if we could claim our own sense of belonging, different but authentic to its core, treaty-based in its origin. I think that's what being Pākehā is about. The fact that it used to be defined exclusively by people from a European heritage is a part of history that we should be leaving behind. But what it means, Alison Jones puts it like this, it means to be someone who lives here, who is not Maori, but is permanently oriented toward Maori. And I think that's a very nice way of summarising it. In other words, we are people who are not Maori, who belong here, who have who claim the right to call this place home, but only insofar as we are in relationship facing the people called Maori. I think that's what it's about.